go ahead and get started. So I'm Brian, for those of you who don't know me, Brian Korgel, Director of the Energy Institute. Thanks for coming today. Thanks to the students and postdocs who are about to speak. So 5-minute lightning rounds. We are tightly controlling time, just so you know. And Dave told me there's like a surprise or there's some indicator for when your time is up. So, you know, just to give you a heads up, there's a poster session after this. So 5-minute talks. 17 seed grants and seed projects that have been going for about 6 months. I'm really looking forward to this. The program, there was $1 million put in by the Office of Vice President of Research to seed 17 projects looking at decarbonization and climate security. So 2 really, really important topics related to energy. We've got 4 different topical areas that are covered. So we try to group the talks as best we could based on everyone's schedules into those topical areas. So again, no time for questions here, but there'll be an hour for poster sessions. So keep track of your questions and feel free to answer or ask the students there. So really looking forward to the week. We're co-hosting Energy Week this year with KBH Energy Center for policy, law, and business, the most important one, McCombs. And we're in a McCombs building, so this is great. So anyway, here we go. Looking forward to it. And Dave Tuttle here is gonna run the show.
Okay, so we have this new rapid fire format. This is new for us too. The idea is just to give introductions, no Q&A, and to draw people to go ask you questions at the poster session at 4 o'clock. We have 4 excellent categories: power grid and e-mobility, clean hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, environmental monitoring, supply chain, circular economy and policy, and overall 17 excellent research projects. And so what I'll do is, let's start. Bala, you want to come up? We'll start off with the first one. This is smart charging and discharging of battery electric vehicles for lower grid emissions and better grid performance. The PIs are Kara Kockelman and Ben Leibowitz. And we have Bala presenting.
Hi all, good afternoon. So I'm Bala, I'm a postdoc in Center for Transportation Research. This work I have done with Kara Kockelman, Ben Leibowitz, and Matt Dean. In this work, what we have done is, in the recent years, there has been a rapid increase in the electric vehicles. So if we charge the electric vehicles without concern to the electricity grid, there is going to be a huge surge in the peak demand, which is detrimental to the operation of the power grid. So what we are doing is, if the charging program, the charging of the electric vehicles aligns with customer needs without regard to the electric grid, it's going to affect the electric grid. Whereas if it aligns with grid's objectives, then it's going to save the emissions, and also it's going to be allow more uptake of renewable energy. So in this study, we try to explore the impact of EV charging strategies on the US power grid's economic and environmental sectors of the US power grid. So the strategic participation rates of EV charging program is based on the smart charging survey conducted by Dean et al. Among 1,000 American adults. And then for the optimization part, we are using a REACH model from NREL. So it's a regional energy deployment system model. So what it does is, it's a capacity expansion model based on linear program. Based on this model, we can evaluate the economic and environmental impacts of the electricity grid. So basically, I will present it's an ongoing work. It's a 2-part work. So I will present the survey results done by Matt Dean, and then the optimization work is currently under progress. So based on the survey, what we have found out is 25% of the Americans outrightly reject in participating any types of smart charging programs. So privacy and then the freedom to charge anytime are the most important criteria. That's why they reject, they are not willing to participate in these programs. And then that around 25% of the Americans is willing to participate, but they need more information about those smart charging programs. And then around 37% of the Americans willing to participate under different conditions. The conditions are around 12% is willing to participate only in the nighttime charging program, around 6% willing to participate only during when there is a high strain in the grid. And then we found that education has an impact in the charging program. One is like if there is a unmanaged charging program, 37% of the uneducated, less educated Americans are not willing to participate in any kind of charging program, whereas people with PhDs, 9% of people with PhDs are against the smart charging programs. And then we also found that gender doesn't have is insignificant in the people choosing the type of smart charging programs. So the work in progress currently we are running the optimization model to find out the different smart charging strategies, which we evaluated from the survey, and then find out how it will affect the help the grid impacts and charging. Another thing is we are designing the incentives to identify how we can control the EV charging only during the night, during the day, and during high grid strain days. And then we are also exploring the possibility of shifting the electricity vehicle demand during the times of high renewable energy generation. Thank you all. See you in front of the post. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, next, we have advanced algorithms for optimizing electricity demand of electric vehicle fleets in Texas to support the grid in local communities. The PIs are Javad Mohammadi and Sergio Castanedas and Paola and Discharge.
Hi, my name is Paula Acevedo. I'm with my colleague Dipanjan. We're both graduate students from the Civil and Electrical Engineering Department. The Austin Climate Equity Plan for 2030 aims that 40% of the vehicle miles traveled are from electric vehicles. This creates a need for a just transition to equitable and sustainable transportation. This brings a challenge to place new charging stations in a strategic and equitable way, and we are considering land use and power grid constraints.
So for any study that deals with the interaction of the power grid with electric vehicles, it becomes essential to analyze whether the grid, by the grid I mean the current generating capacity of the grid, is able to sustain the load generated by the total number of EVs in general. So currently we have around 28,000 EVs on Austin roads approximately, and which is expected to increase at a not so constant rate to about 1.26 million EVs by 2050. So to maintain a holistic approach, we take three different prediction models at the federal, state, and local levels. By federal, I mean the White House. By state, I mean ERCOT. And by local, I mean Austin Energy's own stipulations and calculations of the number of EVs they expect in Austin in 2030 and 2050. And we basically test the grid's performance in terms of supply versus demand. We use the DC optimal power flow approach for this. The graph that is shown here is just for 2023. So at present, with all the EVs plugged in at the same time in the city of Austin, we have, and if you run the DC OPF or the DC optimal power flow at the highest demand that is generated, the green regions basically show the extra generating capacity that we are left with. And the pink regions are the regions depicting the amount of energy that we are utilizing or the grid is supplying for the demand. Now the question arises, what will this graph look like in the coming years? For 2030, we observe that it looks pretty decent and the grid is able to meet the demand that is generated. But in 2050, when we have over 1 million EVs in the city of Austin, the scenario may change and we might need to ramp up our generation accordingly.
For the equitable distribution of charging stations, we are first dividing the city of Austin in 2-kilometer radius hexagon cells to ensure that we have a charging station in a 2-kilometer distance. Then we will conduct an evaluation process with different data such as walkability level, number of residents, jobs, cars, the grid capacity, and more. And we will obtain a ranking of the EV charging stations for the future placement. This will give us a ranking with the optimal placement for the next years. When we have that future placement, we will take those locations and the current charging stations, and we will do a spatial analysis with demographic and socioeconomic indicators and land use data, such as population density, grid data, vehicles available, poverty, education, and more. And we will conduct a quantitative spatial analysis to get an equity index to identify those disparities on the placement of charging stations. Preliminary results show that 32% of census block groups contain the current charging stations, from which 75% of them are predominantly white neighborhoods. And there is a perceived inequity for low and medium income areas, because almost 50% of the charging stations are located in high income census block groups. We aim to address the increased EV adoption and the challenges of placing this new charging stations with grid constraints and land use constraints.
Thank you. Next is Toward Equitable Transportation Electrification in Austin, Texas. PI is Yunfen Zhao, Ijin Song, and Abigail Johnson, and we have John presenting.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone had a afternoon coffee. Our research is titled Toward Equitable Transportation Electrification in Austin, Texas, and our principal investigator is Dr. Junfeng Zhao, Associate Professor in Community and Regional Planning in School of Architecture, and I'm a first-year PhD student in the same program. So our research is actually combining two pilot studies. One is measuring the public electric vehicle charging station assessed disparities, and the other one is measuring the EV ownership disparities in Austin. And the rationale behind conducting this transportation equity analysis, because there are some recent findings in California, Washington, DC, and NYC that the transportation electrification plan is actually composing transportation equity caveats. For instance, white or lone population will likely to have better access to public electric vehicle charging stations, and they are more capable of owning electric vehicles because not only the capital cost, but then they also own a higher capability of owning the benefits of transportation electric vehicles. So for our first study, the public electric vehicle charging stations assessed disparity measurement confirms that Austin is currently experiencing the early stage of good public charger deployment issues. For instance, a non-Hispanic white population will have a higher probability of having a public electric vehicle charging stations to the non-white population, and also upper middle and higher middle income quartile group will likely to have a higher probability of having chargers than the low income regions, as we control the portion of multifamily housing and the distance to nearest public charging stations. And based on our descriptive analysis, the statistical test using nonlinear model also confirms that the ratio of non-Hispanic white population, number of registered EV, household income, and the ratio of above the poverty level and the distance to electric vehicle charging station all have a significant impact on the probability of having a public electric vehicle charging stations. So Here, we conclude that the historically disadvantaged communities, like race and income groups such as a lower income and people of community of colors, also experience a more pronounced disparity in Austin too. And then for the second pilot study, we moved on to uncovering the hidden spatial disparity involving the electric vehicle ownership. Here we employed a K-means unsupervised machine learning techniques, which went through the optimizing process using the select score calculation and the elbow method, and which later went through the statistical mean test, which are known as ANOVA and Tukey's, to tell the significant difference within the clusters. So first of all, for the simplified version, the hotspot analysis result, which only uses the explicit EV ownership data, shows that the hotspots where the EV ownership is high have a 29 percentage point higher chance of having non-Hispanic white population than cold spots, and the mean median household income in hotspot is 81% higher than the cold spots. And this result is obvious because we all know that the I-35 interstate highway demarcates the city between the east and west side of the city. And we all know that the west side of the city are the regions where white alone and higher income mostly rotates. But then we do have an interesting finding using the unsupervised machine learning technique is that we not only have the disparity going on between the east and west side of the city, but there's also significant clusters identified within the west side of the city, known as cluster B and A, colored red and yellow here. So our analysis here revealed a hidden spatial disparity with the 3 types of clusters. The disparity was evident between the east and west, but there was also significant differences within the west regions. In West Austin, for instance, there was a cluster with a high EV registration rate composed of a greater portion of a white alone population, higher income and education levels with graduate degree or professional degrees, and ownership of multiple vehicles. And notably, these clusters had more single-family housing units and open space land use, but were also projected to consume greater site energy, even though they own a multiple vehicles and EVs. So therefore, based on our 2 pilot studies, we conclude that there are some ongoing disparity issues going on with the promotion of electric vehicles, and hope we can go further discuss in the poster session. Thank you.
Next, we go to clean hydrogen. Ammonia reforming to hydrogen using non-equilibrium plasma discharges. The PIs are Fabrizio Bassetti, Thomas Underwood, and we have Drew.
Right, correct. Yes, so I'm the PI on the project. And so I'll be telling you about some work that we've done together with Thomas Underwood. He's the co-PI on the project. Drew and Sai are the 2 students working on the project. So we're interested effectively in ammonia reforming to hydrogen as a way to add value effectively to ammonia. And the way we want to do that is through non-equilibrium plasma discharge. Of course, there is a poster later on that I encourage you to visit where Drew and Sai are going to be there. So the basic idea here that we're pursuing is that plasma discharge may make reforming of ammonia to hydrogen, either complete or partial, much more efficient. So we acknowledge the fact that ammonia has great potential as a hydrogen storage, as well as a hydrogen vector, as well as directly as a carbon-free fuel for power generation. You want to reform it to hydrogen. You want to do that through the 2NH3 to 3H2 plus nitrogen reaction. That is usually done by transition method in a catalysis reaction at 600 C and elevated pressure. So the idea is that we want to take ammonia and we want to use plasmas to energize its internal degrees of freedom and make it effectively a non-Boltzmann distribution of the internal degrees of freedom. The idea then is that when ammonia is energized, it's gonna react more readily with the catalyst at lower temperatures. So ultimately, you wanna achieve the same conversion efficiencies, but at significantly lower temperatures, opening up the potential for distributed ammonia reforming. The way we energize the internal degrees of freedom is by having electrons impact the ammonia And once the electrons impact ammonia, they're going to energize its internal degrees of freedom, mostly vibrational excitation. So here are 2 slides on our preliminary results. And again, I encourage you to talk to Drew and Sai during the poster session. The preliminary experimental data demonstrates that hydrogen is produced when a stream of ammonia is subject to radio frequency excitation with electrons that have fairly low energy. And again, vibrational excitation of ammonia and subsequent perhaps decomposition to hydrogen is optimally achieved at about 0.1 to 0.5 eV. And what you see on the right-hand side here is a plot of the partial pressure of hydrogen that is formed downstream of a radio frequency discharge. As the radio frequency power increases, we start seeing more and more and more hydrogen being formed. Now, this is without a catalyst. This is without a catalyst and at very low pressures down to 1 torr. We do also have some microkinetic modeling that shows the effect of vibrationally hot ammonia when the hot ammonia interacts with the catalyst. And so the bottom line of this plot is that there are really 2 curves for the turnover frequency versus the activation energy. What you have really is that when the ammonia is vibrationally hot, there is a shift in the volcano plot, showing effectively that the presence of vibrationally hot ammonia changes the binding energies. And so this, of course, is modeling as opposed to an experiment, but we're working the model towards, we're working the experiments towards proving or disproving this model prediction. If in fact this model prediction is accurate, that means that having vibrationally excited ammonia, in fact, allows an extra degree of freedom in tailoring the catalysis of ammonia to hydrogen. So again, I'd like to conclude here, invite you to come to the poster where we provide more details. Drew and Sai will be there. And I'd like to thank, of course, the Energy Institute for providing some seed funding. Right. Thank you.
Next up, integrated computational experimental microscopy, elucidation of amorphous electrocatalyst for water splitting. Winnie Wang, Joaquin Ricazo, and Buddy Mullins, and Jing.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jing Lian, and I'm a first-year grad student in Dr. Wang's lab. Today, I'll be presenting my research on computational modeling of nickel oxyhydroxide for water splitting. So hydrogen has been an important source of energy in the renewable industry ever since the past decades, and the demand for hydrogen is projected to be increased by 4-folds by the year of 2050. So to meet this demand, it is important for us to refine or develop our current hydrogen production method. One of these methods is electrochemical water splittings, which can be split into 2 reactions, the hydrogen evolution reaction HER and the oxygen evolution reaction OER. The oxygen evolution reaction is the kinetically limiting step in electrochemical water splitting due to involve a 4-electron transfer in the overall process. So it is important for us to develop a cost-effective and efficient OER catalyst to facilitate the overall hydrogen production. Nickel oxyhydroxide has been reported as a promising OER catalyst, especially in alkaline media. Recent study also found that the catalytic activity can be further enhanced by either transition metal alloying. So in this case, we'll be introducing iron atoms into the nickel, and also by introduction of structural disorder to produce an amorphous surface. Despite knowing this, the optimizations of nickel iron oxyhydroxide is limited due to the poor knowledge on the structure activity relationship. To approach these questions, our research group proposed a combined approach for computational experimental group, where we will benchmark the simulated and measured X-ray absorption spectroscopy to study the structure activity relationship. By doing this, we will be able to illustrate the combined effect of mixed transition metal and amorphizations on the catalytic performance of nickel iron oxyhydroxide. So before this, it's first important to establish a few baseline, which is to determine the structure of the parent crystal, the nickel oxyhydroxide. By doing this, we'll also be able to determine the level of theory required to predict the structure using density functional theory. So the exact structure of nickel oxyhydroxide is not known due to the poor resolution in X-ray diffraction analysis. Currently, most of the models proposed are developed from the redox transformation of beta nickel hydroxides, as shown here. It is generally agreed that all species of nickel oxyhydroxide consist of layers of nickel oxides with different hydrogen compositions. So as of current phase, there are no experimental evidence to pinpoint the exact location of hydrogen atom yet. And among all these redox species, the beta phase of nickel oxyhydroxides are known to be the catalytically active phase. However, the beta and gamma phase are very similar in structures, whereas the gamma phase have intercalated ions. This indicates that the synthesis of pure beta nickel oxyhydroxide require an ion-free environment. We postulate the same mechanism apply for the nickel iron oxyhydroxides, and our collaborators from experimental group in Dr. Malin's group proposed a hydrothermal synthesis method which will allow us to synthesize pure phase of beta nickel iron hydroxide in either the crystalline and amorphous structure form, which we'll be able to benchmark against in the future study. So these are the model of nickel oxyhydroxide I use in my study right now. The native structures are developed by directly removing one hydrogen atom from the nickel hydroxide. While the staggered structure is the duplication of the native structure in the horizontal axis, with every second hydrogen atom on the opposite locations. Whereas the alternate layer structure consists of an interchanging layer of nickel hydroxides and nickel oxides. And this structure is proposed by another computational group developed using a genetic algorithm approach. The last structure is modified staggered structures, which are developed by duplicating the native structures in the in the vertical and horizontal axis, and also by slightly shifting the second layers in the by half a formula unit cell. Overall, we find that the electronic structure of nickel oxyhydroxide is highly sensitive to the hydrogen configuration. So the graph below shows the density of states graph between the staggered structures and the modified staggered structures. We can see that by just shifting the second layers in half a unit cell, we can produce a band gap as big as 0.35 electron volts. Besides, we also found that the relative energy difference between the alternate layer structures and the modified staggered structures to be as low as 0.005 electron volts. This indicates that both structures are highly stable, and this might be the actual crystal of beta nickel oxyhydroxide might contain a mixture of these structures. Overall, we are able to determine that the alternate layer structures and modified staggered structures would be the best model to predict the actual crystal of beta nickel oxyhydroxide. With this as a foundation, we will be able to develop structures for nickel iron oxyhydroxide, and with the help of our experimental group collaborators from Dr. Rizasco and Dr. Malin's lab, we will be able to elucidate the structure activity relationship in the future. I will conclude my presentation now. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to discuss more about my result in the poster session later.
Next, we have controlling intrinsic defects in metal oxides for high performance, low cost green hydrogen production. PIs are Dilia Milleron, Joaquin Rosasco, and Winnie Wang again. Action.
Thank you. Hi, I am Akshat. I'm a first year in the Milleron and Rosasco subgroups, and I work on understanding the role of defects in metal oxide catalysts for green hydrogen production. And I didn't know that animation wasn't going to work here, so consider this as my abstract painting. But what I wanted to motivate here was the larger ambition behind this project, which is to, of course, like produce green hydrogen. But if I had to use one word to explain the larger motivation behind the project, is the number 1.5. The world is heating up due to greenhouse gas emissions, and we want to limit this rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius over the course of this century. And how we think hydrogen can help us achieve that is that we can use it as a fuel to cater to our energy demands, thereby reducing our dependence over fossil fuels. And the main advantage of switching from fossil fuels to hydrogen is the fact that when you burn fossil fuels, you end up producing a lot of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. Whereas when you burn hydrogen, you produce just water. However, there's one more aspect which I wanted to depict using this pie chart, which is still quite visible, is that how do we produce this enormous amount of hydrogen that is required to cater to the world's energy needs? And currently 96% of the hydrogen, which is the black region of the pie chart, is produced through sources such as natural gas, coal, and oil, all of which produce carbon dioxide as a side product while we use them to produce hydrogen. However, rest 4% of the hydrogen, which is actually the green hydrogen, comes from electrolysis of water, or in simple terms, water splitting. And this is where we want to make a dent by increasing its share, by making this process as cheap as possible. And one of the ways you can make the process of water splitting cheap is through finding effective catalysts that are also non-rare earth materials that can break the bond between hydrogen and oxygen with minimum activation energy barrier. And we are particularly interested in this class of materials called transition metal oxides. And we want to understand how the presence of oxygen vacancies in these catalysts can affect the oxygen evolution side of water splitting. And I've shown like 2 LSV plots here for strontium and iron cobalt oxide catalysts, where we can see that as we increase the concentration of oxygen vacancies, the rate at which electrons are produced or oxygen evolution happens in the kinetically controlled region rises more rapidly as we increase the voltage. So it's pretty well established that oxygen vacancies can help you improve the catalytic performance towards OER. But what we lack today is the understanding about what's the mechanism for the same. And the reason it's hard to understand the mechanism is because of the challenges associated with it, which I have mentioned here. It's hard to control oxygen vacancies in your material. Even if you have created oxygen vacancies, it's hard to quantify the actual oxygen vacancy concentration in your material. Also, oxygen vacancies are quite unstable, so they may not last long in the material. And finally, most of the processes that lead to oxygen vacancy creation also cause structural changes or damage to the material, and thereby you are left with a comparison between apples to oranges. We in the Meliron group have developed a synthetic approach to control the formation of oxygen vacancies in nanocrystals using spectator metal salts. And we think this is a great step forward, which would lead us to understanding how oxygen vacancies play a role in catalyzing oxygen evolution reaction in water splitting. What we intend to do in the future is to use this colloidal synthesis approach to create a library of cobalt iron oxide catalysts, which, as you can see from the volcano plot here, is already pretty effective at catalyzing OER. And we want to independently vary the parameters that I've mentioned: nanocrystal size, cobalt to iron ratio, and oxygen vacancy concentration, thereby establishing the influence of each parameter on the catalytic performance of this material. I'd like to acknowledge the Rosasco and Meliron group members. Thank you.
Very good. Our next presentation, leveraging Permian Basin assets for the emerging clean hydrogen economy in Texas. Michael Lewis and Ning. And we have,
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Paula. I'm a graduate research assistant at the Bureau of Economic Geology. And today I'm going to talk about leveraging Permian Basin assets for the emerging clean hydrogen energy economy in Texas. Hydrogen is key to overcoming recent climate challenges and is crucial for a lower carbon energy matrix. Hydrogen is an energy carrier that can be used broadly in several industries that are hard to decarbonize. The Permian Basin is an energy hub that has abundant resources, including fossil fuels, renewables, technology, and an intellectual capital from more than a century of energy production. Our research focuses on the Permian Basin with its abundant natural gas and wind power resources, and explores pathways to leverage both industries and turn their current challenges into future opportunities via clean hydrogen energy. The Permian Basin accounts for 40% of United States oil production and 25% of its natural gas production. It is also a leader in solar and wind development, and it has more than 37 gigawatts of wind power of installed capacity. And this accounts for 24% of the electricity grid in Texas. In this slide, I'll walk you through the 2 pathways that we analyzed for hydrogen technology. The first one is steam methane reforming, or SMR, with a 90% of CO2 capturing. SMR is a mature, widely used technology that accounts for almost all of the hydrogen production today in the United States, but without CCS. SMR produces hydrogen from a methane source, such as natural gas, from three main steps that are steam reforming, water shift, and pressure swing absorption, where hydrogen is purified and CO2 and other impurities are removed. The second technology is water electrolysis that uses wind power as the electricity source, and it splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. In the levelized cost analysis that we performed in our study, we obtained a cost of $1.5 per kilogram of hydrogen produced in the SMR process. 25% of this cost is regarding the CO2 capturing, and the feed cost price, meaning the natural gas price, is the key driver. In the case of electrolysis, we obtain a levelized cost of $2.6 per kilogram of hydrogen. And in this case, electricity price is the key driver. The Permian Basin has an advantage in both cases because of its abundant natural gas and wind resources. An important factor to analyze in our levelized cost analysis is the recent production tax or PTC credits announced in the Inflation Reduction Act. This PTC could reduce SMR cost in $0.64. And in the case of electrolysis, it could reduce in 1.73. This credit varies depending on the CO2 emissions of the technology. To summarize, hydrogen is key in decarbonization, and the Permian Basin plays an important role in this recent challenge. If we assume a PTC of $1 per kilogram of hydrogen in the SMR technology and $3 per kilogram in electrolysis, we can observe that this credit can make them both cost competitive to one another. And also another important factor is that both pathways their water consumption is low, for around 5 gallons per kilogram of hydrogen. Moving forward, we plan to study the value of the co-products such as CO2 for EOR and oxygen for ATR hydrogen production. Also, we plan to study the infrastructure requirements for transportation and storage of hydrogen and energy carriers such as ammonia. We know that local demand can cover initial expansion of hydrogen. However, takeaway capacities to a regional market such as the Gulf Coast could further expand the oil production. Overall, the Permian Basin is a promising location for the development of hydrogen energy. Thank you.
Next, we have hydrogen production at natural gas wellheads. Lou Yinda and Kishore Mohanty are the PIs, and Dina. First slide.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dina Al-Hosari. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Petroleum and Geosystems Department. I'll be giving a brief presentation on our research topic titled Hydrogen Production at Natural Gas Wellheads. So our research team consists of Dr. Yingda Liu, Dr. Kishore Mohanty as the principal investigators, myself, and Ha Wang as the graduate students working on it. So the main motivation behind this research is that hydrogen plays an indispensable role as a clean energy carrier in future decarbonized energy systems. Steam methane reforming remains a major route to produce hydrogen. However, conventional existing SMR gas production and carbon dioxide sequestration remains largely separated with little integration. So the main drawbacks of the existing hydrogen production by conventional SMR plants includes the fact that you need methane as the feedstock for these SMR plants. However, These natural gas wells are usually located very far away from SMR plants. So the only way to transport them is via pipelines, which leads to higher costs and no CCUS employment due to these high costs. So what we're proposing is an innovative process that integrates absorption enhanced SMR, natural gas production, and CO2 sequestration. So basically in this proposed work, what we're suggesting is that instead of transporting methane gas from far gas well sites, why not have the SMR plant right next to the gas wellheads? Yes, and you would, instead of using a conventional SMR unit, you'd use absorption enhanced SMR unit. So the methane will enter the reformer where it reacts with the steam to produce and undergoes a water shift reaction to produce hydrogen, while the CO2 is absorbed instead of being emitted like in the case with conventional SMR. The CO2 is then injected back into these gas wells where it will enhance gas recovery and be sequestered. So basically the significance would be that you're producing low carbon hydrogen, also known as blue hydrogen. You're also simultaneously utilizing and sequestering the CO2, enhancing the gas production. You'll also create hydrogen hubs in Texas and subsurface hydrogen production technology. The project consists of 3 main tasks. The first task involves developing reservoir models considering the effect of CO2 injection on gas production. The second task involves identifying and evaluating high-capacity CO2 adsorbents for CO2 and hydrogen separation process. And the third task involves carrying out a techno-economic analysis of the integrated process. So our progress so far in terms of task 1, we've already established a representative 2D reservoir model for gas recovery under CO2 injection using CMG-GEM software. We've also carried out sensitivity analysis to examine the effect of permeability heterogeneity, formation thickness, and CO2 injection rate on the gas recovery factor. As for task 2, we've designed and constructed an apparatus for testing the performance of the CO2 adsorbents. We've also carried out a literature review to identify a few adsorbent candidates for testing. We've also performed preliminary characterization on those potential adsorption candidates. As for task 3, we've completed the chemical process simulation setup for conventional SMR and absorption enhanced SMR using Aspen Plus software. We've also conducted sensitivity analysis of the pressure, temperature, CH4H2 ratio on the methane conversion. Thank you for listening, and please stop by our poster, Station 8, for any questions. Thank you.
Very good. All excellent presentations. Thank you. We have a break now for about 15 minutes. Convene back here at 3:05. There are refreshments right outside, coffee, lemonade, restrooms right over here. This door happens to be open, and we'll start off with carbon capture, utilization, and storage at 3:05. Okay, reconvening. We're making good time and all excellent presentations. So our next section is focused on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And with that, first presentation for this section is self-sealing capacity of wellbore cement under geologic CO2 storage. PIs are Charles Worth, Maria Younger, Sahar Bakshan, and we have Richard presenting.
Thank you, and thanks for letting me kick off this carbon session. I'm going to talk about a project that we have, which is a joint venture between the Gulf Coast Carbon Center and the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering. So we're looking at the interaction between subsurface fluids that are sort of induced by the injection of CO2 into storage aquifers. And I am a GRA, and I would like to mention, in addition to the great PIs that he just mentioned, we also have my collaborating student, David Kim, working on this project as well. And so we kind of typically tout geologic sequestration as this high capacity, permanent storage, but really potential leaks may jeopardize our characterization of this as effectively permanent storage. And so one of the potential leakage pathways are existing wellbores. And in Texas, we're no strangers to existing wellbores for oil and gas. And these were originally created to do the thing that we do not want them to do, is extract fluids from the subsurface. And so they have connectivity potentially between our storage reservoir and shallower depths or the surface. But the main problem being that CO2 may enter them and leak out of them. But really, they should be isolated from the reservoir when they're finished. But problems with their cement, including poor bonds or fractures in their cement, may give access to your reservoir fluid into the wellbore and cause leakage. But cement is not just a sort of pathway. It's also an active participant in the processes of fluid flow. And so the geochemistry involved here, actually the cement plays a big role. So the brine that we inject CO2 in and mixes together is acidified. That dissolves some of the cement, releasing hydroxide and calcium ions, as well as some other free ions, and pushing this carbonate reaction towards the formation of aqueous carbonate, and then a bunch of those free calcium ions. So our approach is to look at this and its capacity to seal up some of those fractures and some of those pathways. And how we do this is we create a microfracture flow cell. So we take Class H Portland cement, which is used in the construction of well bores. We make a bulk sample in anaerobic conditions. We fashion it to the dimensions of this chip that we then encase in PDMS, and then we mechanically induce a fracture, and then connect it to our closed system loop and flow our simulated CO2 fluid through there, which is CO2 saturated brine in equilibrium with calcite. And then so what we found is that this process actually does clog up the fracture. In the longest it's taken so far is 15 hours. There's no more communication between the inlet and the outlet. And so we do see this process actually completely inhibiting the flow across the fracture. But in addition to just that kind of pressure buildup and failure of communication between the inlet and the outlet, we also see some characteristic behavior of the precipitate that's formed within that fracture. So if we zoom in, these are SEM images with micron scale, more or less, of the precipitates. And then so we have a rhombohedral kind of calcite that is formed in this case. And then we have these sea urchin-like needle structures, really kind of a perfect example of aragonite. And then so we test different chemical compositions. And so we have the fluid that I just described on the left here, but then in addition to that, we also have incorporated surfactant, which you might find in an EOR scenario or a depleted field, or this leakage pathway is an existing wellbore away from our injection wellbore. So that could have been evolved in oil and gas operations. And so there could be some presence of surfactant there. And then we actually see a different kind of precipitate there, where it's more rounded and less those straight angles and kind of calcite rhombohedral region. And so we're working on quantifying some of the sizes and characteristics of these precipitates, where along the flow path it occurs, and the effects of these different chemical compositions of the water in sort of realistic environments. And I'm really pleased to work on this project and thank the Energy Institute for the funding and the support. And with that, I will send it off to the next person. Thank you.
Next, we have computational design and engineering of biocatalysts for CO2 conversion. The PIs are Yi Lu and Mariana Aluru, and we have Young Lin.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Yun Ling. I'm a postdoc from Professor Yi Lu's lab. And today I'm going to presenting the work about computational design and engineering of biocatalyst for CO2 reduction. As you can see, this is a collaborative work done by the Professor Yi Lu's lab and the Professor Aluru's lab. And we are the team that doing both experimental and the computational studies. And the computational results shown in the slides are mainly performed by the graduate student, Morhan. All right, so as we know, to tackle the problem of greenhouse gas emission related to carbon dioxide, designing new catalysts is of urgent need. And among the new catalysts, designing biocatalysts for converting CO2 into valuable products is a green way to minimize greenhouse gas emissions and to provide a sustainable future. So our lab has engineered the myoglobin, which is an oxygen binding protein, into CO2 reduction enzyme by simply replace the iron heme with the cobalt porphyrin. And we found this newly designed enzyme can reduce CO2 to carbon monoxide with multi-turnover under the photocatalytic conditions using visible light. And by tuning the secondary coordination sphere of the protein, which tune the interactions with the carbon dioxide substrate, we can further enhance the activity of our catalyst. And the experimental work has been recently published. We want to take advantage of the advancement in the computational field to advance our understanding of the mechanism of the CO2 reduction in our system and to build the next generation of more active catalysts based on myoglobin. To answer that question, we have three specific aims. We want to use the computational method to determine the oxidation state of the cobalt center, which is responsible for CO2 binding and activation. We also want to calculate the energy landscape associated with the CO2 activation and the reduction. And by answering those two questions, we'll eventually identify favorable secondary coordination interactions to build the next generation of more advanced catalysts for CO2 reduction. The methodology that we apply for this study is called QMMM, which stands for Quantum Mechanics and Molecular Mechanics method. And this, when we apply this method to a large system such as myoglobin with hundreds of amino acids, tons of items, we need to carefully choose the reagent for QM as well as MM reagent to minimize the computational load. And after we choose the reagent for QM, MM, we use this methodology to first perform benchmarking. We can reproduce the high resolution crystal structure by calculating the distance, bound distance associated with the cobalt with the coordinating nitrogen items from both the porphyrin as well as the histidine ligand. We can also do benchmarking to reproduce the electronic absorption features that we can observe from experimental studies. And we can see the shift of the absorption spectrum from the cobalt-3 oxidation state to the cobalt-2. This actually reproduced our observation from experiments. So with those results, we can use the method now to apply to the system to make some predictions. Our preliminary simulation results show that the carbon dioxide does not bind to the cobalt-2 oxidation state. However, it combines to the cobalt 0 or cobalt 1 oxidation state with similar binding affinities. So which means that a lower oxidation state than the cobalt 2 is required for CO2 binding and activation. We also performed the calculation for the CO2 binding system, and we find that before the CO2 binding, there is charge delocalization on the porphyrin system, and upon the CO2 binding, there is charge transfer from the porphyrin onto the CO2. And with these promising preliminary results, we want to further study and calculate the energy landscapes associated with the CO2 activation and the reduction into carbon monoxide, and use this established methodology to identify the favorable secondary coordination sphere for CO2 binding and activation. And eventually want to adopt the machine learning technique, which really tackle the timescale limit to help us to calculate the free energy in a faster timescale. Thank you all for listening. So I will chat more over the poster session. Thank you.
Next, we have impacts of geochemistry on carbon dioxide absorption in organic rich mud rocks. PIs are Zoya Hedari and Nicholas Espinoza. And
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending this presentation. My name is Ibrahim Goma. Today, I'm presenting you our topic about the influence of geochemistry on the competitive CO2 storage in organic rich mud rock. My advisor and the PI of this project, Professor Haidari, and the co-PIs, Dr. Nicholas Espinoza. So first of all, our motivation to deploy CO2 storage in organic rich mud rock is that you all know about the global warming problem. And one of the solutions to this problem is using CO2 storage. Is one of the attractive solutions that enable us to reduce the emission of CO2 while maintaining our current energy resources. There should have been an image here, but it's not working. So why organic rich mud rock or shale gas reservoir? Because they have a wide variety of fractures with a wide range of sizes that enable CO2 storage in different mechanisms. One of these mechanisms is CO2 storage or trapping by absorption. In fact, CO2 trapping by absorption is one of the major trapping mechanisms for CO2 sequestration. However, the composition of these reservoirs mainly consist of clays, pyrite, and kerogen. So there's a need to understand what are the parameters affecting the storage, the CO2 storage in these kind of reservoirs. Here we are modeling two main constituents of this reservoir, which are clay and kerogens. The kerogen structure we are modeling represent kerogen of different types and different thermal maturity, while the clay structure we are modeling, we make sure that they represent the pore size of the clay underground. And we made sure also that they represent the chemical structure, and we unified their pore size to check the influence of clay geochemistry on the adsorption process. The adsorption simulation was carried out in Grand Canonical Monte Carlo simulation, where the system energy, temperature, and volume are kept constant, while the number of gas molecules are allowed to fluctuate to mimic the actual adsorption experiment or the actual adsorption process. The total system energy was just a summation of linear joule potential and the electrical Coulombic potential. So the initial result for this study are here, where we evaluated the competitive adsorption of CO2 and methane for different kerogen types. And we can see that CO2 has more affinity to get adsorbed to the kerogen of different types more than methane. This actually can be attributed to the enthalpy of adsorption of CO2 in the surface of kerogen, which is usually higher than methane, as we can see in this bar chart here. And this actually enhanced our idea of using this technique not only for CO2 storage, but also for enhanced gas recovery in this kind of reservoirs.
Secondly, we investigated the influence of corrosion thermal maturity on CO2 absorption, and we saw that while we increased the thermal maturity of our corrosion structures, we had an increasing absorption capacity of CO2 in these reservoirs. And this actually can be explained by the increasing pore volume of these structures while we are increasing their thermal maturity. And thirdly, we investigated the influence of reservoir temperature on CO2 absorption. And as you can see here, increasing reservoir temperature from 300 Kelvin to 400 Kelvin reduced the absorption capacity of CO2 by almost 50%. And this actually attributed to the exothermic nature of the CO2 absorption process. And finally, for the clay structures, we noticed that kaolinite clay has more affinity to store CO2 in our models than in light due to the negative surface charge of the light clay surface. This negative surface charge led to some repulsion forces between the polar CO2 compounds and the surface of the clay. More information, you can find them during the poster session. And thank you.
Next, we have combining quantitative leakage risk assessment with financial liability for CO2 geological storage. PIs are Sahar Bakhshan, Sue Hovorka, Jim Dyer, and we have Blajek.
So hello everyone, my name is Blajek Isaac. I'm currently a graduate student in the Petroleum Engineering Department. I'm currently working as a GRA in the Bureau of Economic Geology alongside Dr. Bakhshan and Dr. Hovorka. And I'll be presenting on combining quantitative leakage risk assessment with financial liability for CO2 geologic storage. So one of the main investment risks for CO2 geologic storage is the cost risk associated with when CO2 storage fails, and that there is a leakage event of CO2 and brine to either the underground sources of drinking water as well as the atmosphere. And the main potential leakage pathways for these events are legacy wells or abandoned wells that are in the existing reservoir which we are injecting to. And as these wells may be very old, their completion and abandonment practices may not be the best. And so there have been many studies done on existing CO2 migration through these legacy wells to the atmosphere and to the surface. However, there is an existing gap in the research on determining that if a CO2 storage project does fail, then what is the long-term liability of such a project? And so to answer this question, we need to determine, predict the consequential leakage events, as well as their frequency and the environmental impacts that each event has, as well as the costs associated with their environmental remediation, as well as the mitigation of these leaks. And then to quantify those costs that are incurred by the different stakeholders of the project. And by combining all of these three things, we can develop a cost curve for designing commercial insurance for future geologic CO2 storage projects that will help promote continuing investments into these type of projects as well as larger ones. So our methodology to tackle this problem consists of these main elements. So we develop a time-sensitive statistical probability model to determine the potential leakage events of CO2 storage. And we do this based on the leakage rates as well as the cumulative leakage as well as leakage duration. And then we can assess the environmental impacts that each leakage event has. And so, for example, CO2 leakage to the groundwater can alter its geochemistry, as well as CO2 leakage to the soil can affect its plant and microbial environment, as well as CO2 to the atmosphere can lead to being harmful for the humans as well as land animals. And then once we have the probability of a leakage event happening, as well as its environmental impact that it could potentially incur, then we can quantify the costs that would be incurred by preventing such an event from happening, as well as the mitigation of this event. And then we can determine that with stakeholders as what the investors of the project, what costs each individual stakeholder is responsible for in the event that a leakage does happen. And so we simulated our leakage events using the Tough2 T2 Well software. And so how we approached this problem was to create a coupled reservoir model where the reservoir and wellbore are two different subdomains and the fluid is controlled by different physics, and that there is turbulent and non-isothermal flow, as well as upward and downward flow of CO2 and brine. And so we solve the equations of non-isothermal, multi-phase, and multi-component flows. And we plan on developing the probability distribution of the leakage rates, considering a wide range of geological and operational parameters, such as the distance of the injection well to the legacy well, the rate of injection, as well as the distance to the shallow aquifer, and et cetera. And so we simulated the leakage to the surface through the wellbore casing and wellbore annulus, as we believe those to be the most consequential leakage events. And so for example, you can see one of our simulations for open and closed boundary conditions of CO2 and brine leakage rates to the surface, and some of the reservoir parameters we used, as well as a visualization of our simulation. So we simulate a variety of different parameters, and more are included on the poster board, which I'll be happy to talk about. And then in the future, we want to quantify the environmental impacts of the leakage events to different receptors, and then after quantifying the environmental impacts, quantify the monetary impacts of each leakage event, and determine which stakeholders would be responsible for it. And we hope this will lead to developing a robust financial framework, which you can use for the CO2 industry in general. Thank you very much.
Next, we have carbon dioxide hydrates-based carbon sequestration on the seabed. PIs are Bamev Badadur and Yingda Liu, and Awan is presenting.
Hey everyone, my name is Awan. I work with Dr. Vaibhav Bahadur in mechanical engineering department. And we are working on a new technology for carbon storage, which is essentially a leak-free method of storing CO2. And like you've already seen, the leakage is an issue with carbon storage, like my previous presenter just discussed. So what are hydrates? Hydrates are essentially ice-like structures where water molecules are bounded together using hydrogen bonds, and a guest molecule is embedded within it. It could be CO2, it could be methane, it could be hydrogen, it could be anything. We are currently looking at CO2 hydrates as a means for storage, because now the CO2 is in a solidified form, so it's not going to move around. So the leakage issues are prohibited. And you can see on the image here, this is essentially a plug of CO2 hydrates, which looks like a snow cone. So now this plug of CO2 hydrates would need to be stored at a particular location in the geological system where it would be thermodynamically stable. Such conditions are available on the seabed. As you can see, if you look at the hydrothermal gradient and the geothermal gradient and the equilibrium curve of the CO2 hydrate, you see this region ABC is where the CO2 hydrate is going to be stable. So if you place the CO2 hydrate plugs on the seabed, then it would stay stable there for eternity. One interesting issue there is that if it is in direct contact with the water, then it would essentially seep into the water over time. And so we need to seal it properly before it can be stored. And a few key advantages here is that it is highly condensified, it is solidified, so it's immobile, it's highly condensified, so it requires much lesser space. Seabed is available all over the world. It's denser than water, so it's going to stay on the floor more easily. And so the objectives of this project is essentially to look at how do we implement such a technology and bring it to market. And the other thing is that, can we use this technology for impure streams of CO2? Let's say we only have a 50% pure CO2 stream. Can we still use this technology to store CO2 and while also capturing the carbon? So I'll talk about how we are thinking that this technology can be brought to fruition. So it will essentially be a two-stage process. First process will be where the CO2 line, which is coming from a capture site, would be converted into CO2 hydrate slurry inside a bubble column reactor. So for each pass of CO2 hydrate, some of the gas will be consumed with the water into CO2 hydrates. The rest will need to be recirculated back for further consumption. And then this slurry will need to be accumulated and then go into another chamber where the slurry would be compacted for further compaction into a CO2 hydrate plug. Now this plug would need to be stored, sealed, essentially providing an impermeable coating around the plug, and then they can be stored on the seabed. So if we, from basic calculations, we see that if we look at a 3-meter high CO2 hydrate plug, only a kilometer square is needed for a megaton of CO2 storage, which are phenomenal numbers. And so an alternative approach we're looking at is that we could make the slurry on this coast and then transport the slurry into the ocean surface, and then for further compaction, sealing, and disposal. One key benefit is that the ocean surface is already providing us the pressure and temperature needed for hydrate formation and stability. So refrigeration over pressurization will not be needed. There's a few challenges with this technology, again, like the sealing part, where the sealing needs to be environmentally friendly but not degradable. And then there's other challenges like economic challenges where there's no revenue stream for a technology like that. If we do get CO2 and we store it, like who's going to pay us for that? The current work that we're looking at is threefold. First is that we have an experimental setup where we control flow rates on one side, we form hydrates in the middle, and we measure the fluid on the other side, and we evaluate how much rate is of a hydrate being formed in each pass. Secondly, we also have a computational model where we are simulating bubble column reactor, and we are seeing that the gas flow rate, if is increased, the amount of gas consumed is increased, but the percentage that's converted in each pass is decreasing. So there needs to be there's going to be a techno-economic sweet spot in the middle, and that's what we're optimizing right now. And on the third side, we're also looking at hydrate slurry transport. Dr. Liu's group is working on this, where they're using a collision theory used for CO2 hydrate slurry transportation and looking at pressure drops and energy requirements for hydrate slurry transport. I'll be happy to discuss more of details on this during my poster. Thank you.
Next, we have laboratory experiments and modeling to accurately evaluate critical CO2 saturation for geologic carbon storage. So we have PIs Hailun Nai, Sahar Bakshan, and David DiCarlo, and Jose is presenting.
Good afternoon all. I'm Jose Willis. I'm in the Petroleum Engineering Department, but I work for the Gulf Coast Carbon Center within the Bureau of Economic Geology. Today, I will briefly introduce you to our ongoing work in laboratory experiments and modeling to accurately evaluate critical CO2 saturation for geologic carbon storage. So effective geologic carbon storage projects requires good simulations to obtain accurate retention capacity. But the outputs of our model will be as good as our inputs that will be highly affected by small-scale heterogeneities. Previous simulation have shown that even with inaccurate CO2 critical saturation, about 48%, only 21% of that CO2 will remain trapped inside the reservoirs. So critical CO2 saturation, it's an important input to our parameters that has been studied, that it controls CO2 saturation and trapping capacity. So now that we understand why it is important to model these small-scale heterogeneities and to understand how the CO2 will flow and will be trapped inside the reservoirs, it is important to conduct intermediate-scale sand experiments that in our lab, we are able to basically build any type and any degree of heterogeneities inside the sandbox. Also, we can conduct multiple multi-phase flow experiments where we can capture CO2 critical saturation fields using light transmission techniques, but mainly we conduct these experiments as closely as reality as possible, because we do this experiment to be buoyancy driven flow. So from our work that we have been doing at least 1 year already, we kind of show and demonstrate that even with the slightly changes in bed form architectures, we have different plume migration, different breakthrough saturation. In this case will be the critical CO2 saturation, and different breakthrough time. As we can see here in the plots I'm showing, basically it's the same bed form ripples. We did slightly changes in the phase of the crest of those ripples. And as we can see just by looking at the images, it's a different saturation field just with the slightly changes. For our future work, we are planning to validate these results with core flow experiments and simulation. I would like to invite you all to our poster session, which is located at stand 14. And I would like to thank the Energy Seed Grant for our funding. Thank you so much.
With that, we now move to environmental monitoring, supply chain, circular economy, and policy. So our first presentation in this category, Go Clean Fast, the political economy of green industrial policy. PIs are Josh Busby, Nathan Jensen, and we have Paul.
Well, thank you so much to the Energy Institute for having us today and for supporting this research. Congratulations to all the other research that's been done. It's fascinating and really nice to see so much work being done in the space. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Orsog, and I'm a second-year Master's of Global Policy Studies candidate at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Today, I'll be discussing a research project that I've conducted over the past year with our two PIs, Dr. Nathan Jensen, Professor of Department of Government, and Dr. Joshua Busby from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, as well as one other master's student at the LBJ School, Isabella Steinhauer. In this endeavor, our PI set out to answer the question, what would it take for the US economy to go green fast? With the Biden administration's goal of reducing carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 and getting to net zero by 2050, the question was, how could this be done in an efficient and fast manner? While typical energy transitions have historically occurred over 50 to 100 years, the urgency of the climate challenge today means that we don't have that kind of time. While market conditions for electric vehicles and renewables are favorable, we know that further development at scale cannot be possible without concerted government policies. As we all witnessed this past August with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, spurred a much needed wave of investment in domestic renewable energy manufacturing, and according to modeling, suggests that we are now on a path to hitting these lofty goals. With financing mechanisms via tax credits and even direct pay for some technologies, and the recognition of funding assistance to energy communities, the new wave of investment in clean energy is spurring the creation of this new economy. As you'll notice from some of the questions in the bubbles above, we set out to create a workshop to gather some of the brightest minds in political science, economics, and public affairs to answer the critical questions and create a series of memos, videos, and also a virtual conference that we had just a few weeks ago to discuss these issues. The goal of the project is to create material that could be used by journalists, policymakers, or also in the classroom. As you'll see here, we have some of the memos, as well as we had about 20 participants either author or co-author memos on topics of their choosing. And then also create short 5-minute videos discussing their memo topics. And these topics range from the effects of the clean energy transition on labor markets to what industrial policy in China and other places worldwide can teach us here in the US. On the bottom left, you'll see Jesse Jenkins from Princeton University. He leads the REPEAT project, which helped model the emission pathways of the Inflation Reduction Act. And what he found in his modeling is that although we won't be able to get to the 50% threshold that the Biden administration is looking forward to in 2030, we will get to 37 to 41%, which is an incredible achievement to say the least. On the top right, we have Joanna Lewis of Georgetown University, who gave the conference a really global insight into how China has become the world leader in renewable energy technology manufacturing through a bevy of industrial policies and what that means for geopolitics worldwide. Finally, on the bottom right, you can see a screenshot of the virtual conference that we conducted just a few weeks ago with the 20 plus of us. During the discussion at the conference, three important questions rose. The first, how did the IRA pass when cap and trade failed? As many of you might be aware, in 2009, the Waxman-Markey Senate bill failed in US Congress to set a cap and trade, which cap and trade policy is essentially setting a top level of emissions that firms can emit into the atmosphere. The question was, for our panelists, what was the importance of public opinion and industry leaders who were pushing for the need for tax incentives via the IRA, or these what they call carrot policies that assist firms, rather than the stick policies such as cap and trade, which punish polluting companies. Our next large question that arose was, can industrial policy work in the US? While most of the panelists believe that it could, numerous questions came up as to how it might work. From managing how states go out and seek clean energy investments to energy poverty needing to be recognized to have a just transition, the consensus was that implementation phase will be critical as the US continues its industrial ambitions. Finally, what are the global implications of this new shift? As we've seen from the IRA's passage, transatlantic economic relations with our European partners have been ruffled as a plethora of European firms have jumped to the US to build out their operations and take advantage of these tax incentives. This has led EU member states to push for their own green domestic industrial policies so as not to lose their industrial base. These themes and questions will continue to arise as we build out the new energy economy. We invite you to join us at our booth outside afterwards, and also where you can watch any of our scholars' 5-minute videos and talk to us about them. I also encourage you to scan the QR code if you'd like to see our website. We also have the link right up there if you'd like to visit. Thank you so much for your time.
Next, developing a network of ecological sensors for analysis of long-term acoustic and environmental data. PIs are Timothy Kite and Andrea Kutina. Is it?
Hello, everyone. I'm Isa Kazan, an undergraduate research assistant and first-year student in the College of Natural Sciences. And I'm part of the KIT lab, and we are in the Department of Integrated Biology. And I'd like to share with you our work of building and deploying environmental sensing systems for long-term analysis of acoustic and environmental data. So the Balcones Canyonlands are a 30,000-acre preserve in Travis County, which protects multiple endangered species. And due to rapid urbanization and shifting microclimates, there have been a lot of questions arising that we don't always have the resources to answer, because it doesn't always make sense to send a researcher out to the preserve and collect 4 different types of data over a specified interval each time we want to monitor something. So we began our work of creating these environmental sensing systems that have multiple capacities, such as collecting data on atmospheric data, altitude, temperature, humidity, and soil moisture, as well as bioacoustic data, which in our focus includes bird calls and the call of the golden cheeked warbler, which is an endangered species native to Texas. And this effort, this has been part of a threefold multidisciplinary effort, including our faculty, Timothy Kitt and Andrea Cantina, PIs, in collaboration with Preston Wilson and Brendan Allison, as well as all of our undergraduate research assistants. So aside from the development aspect, lots of efforts have gone into analysis, which is mostly comprised of using machine learning for source separation. So we can differentiate general noise from anthropogenic noise from bioacoustic data, which includes the bird calls. And within that, we also want to differentiate the sound of the golden cheek warbler from other bird calls so that we can gain insights on the behavior of these species as well as the anthropogenic influences. Along with this, there have been efforts in testing, which has included a series of rotation studies to assess the effects of angular rotation and outer casing of a microphone on the data that it subsequently records. So as part of our effort to create these sensors in a way that is accessible and reproducible for people of diverse educational backgrounds, we have created our first draft of a manuscript to, which is an instructional building manuscript to publish in Elsevier's Hardware X. And we've also managed to complete 2 of these sensors since the beginning of this year, as well as our full series of rotation studies. We hope to create 5 more by the end of the year and use it to deploy our network of sensors and gain insights on these patterns across the greater geography of Texas. Thank you.
Next, we have uncertainty quantification for circular economies and supply chains. PIs are Michael Baldia and Erhan Gutanoglu, and we have Raymond.
Hi everyone, my name is Raymond Park and I'm part of the Equitable Department of Chemical Engineering and also the Department of Mathematics. And my project was on uncertain quantification of the circular economy. And so one of the biggest components of leading a sustainable environment and sustainable economy is diverting waste material into more reusable goods. And so we do that by trying to recirculate the waste material into a more circular configuration. However, this carries a lot of uncertainty in the process as waste material contains has a lot of uncertainties in the source of where it comes. So for example, the source of waste material can lead to different recovery rates and also unpredictable time delays between when the waste was collected and the waste was produced. And so we try to formulate this into rather a probabilistic approach rather than a deterministic process. And so we have 3 objectives here. So we want to first model we want to create a prototypical circular economy model, and also try to quantify the effect that the uncertainty has on the system. And then finally formulate an inventory policy to negate the effect of the uncertainty. So like I said before, we want to try to model the circular economy, and we use something called a state task network. So we have 4 different states here in which the product will undergo through. So we have first, the product will be manufactured, and then consumers will utilize the product, and then it needs to be collected, such as in the garbage can, and then it needs to be reprocessed again. However, depending on how efficiently that we can reprocess these goods, we need to add some raw material or something called virgin raw material. And by formulating these and with the reprocessed material, we can combine them to create more products. And based on, so we will also model these using a first order time delay. And the transition between each of these material states will be determined by a transfer function and also a time delay, a processing capacity, and also a material inventory that we see in the red boxes. And we consider 2 case studies here. We have the ideal case study, so we have no processing delays. And then we also have that we assume that all the material can be recycled fully. But however, this is not the case in the realistic world, because we also have some information delay that involves, for example, markets like Walmart or Costco may ask for some bottle number of goods, but manufacturing sites, and it takes some time for the information to get to the sites. And we have also sub-unitary efficiency. Obviously, not all waste material can be reprocessed. And so we have to add some less than 1 efficiency into the system. So we have used a Monte Carlo simulation rather than something like polynomial chaos expansion because of the nonlinearity that involves in the system. So we have seen that there's a strong impact of the variability of the processing capacity on the inventory level. And this really calls us for us to find a inventory policy to combat the effect of the negative effect of the uncertainty. And we use this we'll rely on something called a feedback control loop, which will we will update our processing delays and operation capacity as new information becomes available in the supply chain. And we expect to take a more probabilistic approach, like I said before, that we can tune our inventory policy depending on what probability we want for our inventory to remain at. Thank you.
Well, excellent. We not only had discipline as far as our schedule and got through 17 excellent presentations, but they were all very good. Appreciate that. So next